Good morning. We would like to welcome you to our webinar today, where we will be discussing the Fair Tax Campaign to resolve our state's budget crisis and make sure that we have adequate funding for vital programs and services. Just a few announcements we'd like to make before we get started. If you have questions, you will be able to submit those using the chat feature. And also, we do have some materials available for you. So we have the slides, and then there's a sign-in sheet that is specific to some of the work that we are doing with the Responsible Budget Coalition to advocate for fair tax. So you'll get a chance to also download that, and we'll give you some more details later on in our presentation. And also, if you would like to use captioning during the webinar, there is a link that you can use that for. So Housing Action Illinois is a statewide coalition that unites 160 plus organizations with the goal of ensuring that everyone in our state, especially the lowest income families, have a good place to call home. We empower communities to protect and expand affordable housing by building the capacity of housing nonprofits through training opportunities, one-on-one support, and direct technical assistance. And we also advocate for policies and laws that end and prevent homelessness, protect renters, and support struggling homeowners in the community. We care about the state budget because many of the housing programs that we advocate for do receive state funding. So the Illinois Affordable Housing Trust Fund is a program that was one of Housing Action's first successful housing campaigns. When we started as a coalition 30 years ago, we were able to establish this program that helps us to create affordable housing. We also have programs like the Rental Housing Support Program that also create housing. In addition to that, there are programs that end and prevent homelessness that we focus our advocacy priorities on. So that includes the Homeless Prevention Program and the Emergency and Transitional Housing Program. We work in coalition with several partners throughout the state to advocate for those line items, as well as supportive housing and the Homeless Youth Program. One of the programs that, or as we look at those programs, we know that they have historically been underfunded. So when we think about in last year, we did see a slight increase in the funding for those programs, but the funding is still not close to what it was in previous years. For example, the Homeless Prevention Program was funded at $11 million in fiscal year 2008, and then in fiscal year 2018, the program was funded at $4.9 million. So we're definitely not where we want to be in terms of the funding for those programs. In addition to those programs that I've mentioned, we also advocate for the foreclosure prevention program, which helps us to work in partnership with housing counseling agencies to serve homeowners. Another program related to housing that's a priority for Centers for Independent Living within our network is the Community Reintegration Program, which helps people leaving nursing facilities move into their apartments in the community.
And this is Bob. I'm just going to check in. If you have any issues with the audio or the video, please type it into the question session, and we'll try and respond. But it seems like everything is working okay.
So every year, Housing Action partners with the National Low Income Housing Coalition to release a report that illustrates the need for affordable housing. And so when we look at this report, and the visual we have on the screen now is just a highlight from 2017, what we have found is that there's no place in Illinois, whether you're looking at the Chicago metro region or even rural communities in southern Illinois where a minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And so as you see on this slide, to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, a minimum wage worker would need 2.5 jobs. And then further illustrating the need for affordable housing is just looking at where we are in terms of the shortage for affordable housing that's both affordable and available to extremely low-income households in our state. So the maximum state income for a 4-person household that is extremely low income in Illinois is $24,250 a year. Since we have a shortage of affordable housing, many of the low-income families in Illinois are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, which means there's less money left over for groceries, health care, child care, and even savings. We just want to highlight, as we're about to go into more details on the Responsible Budget Coalition, those of us in the Housing Action Office that you can reach out to so that you can get involved in the work that we're doing to make sure that we have the public funding we need for housing. So Bob Palmer is our policy director. I'm Gianna Baker. I'm the outreach manager. And we also have Willie Heineke, who is our outreach associate here. The Responsible Budget Coalition is a network of about 300 plus organizations throughout the state that fights for adequate revenue to support state priorities and make smart investments. The RBC also advocates to end the cuts to vital programs and services and fairness in raising revenue. Today's call is going to focus on just providing an overview of the campaign and a timeline of our next steps in order to get a fair tax in Illinois. And we also want to just provide an opportunity to support you to be able to advocate alongside with us in the communities that you serve. Yeah, so the goal of the fair tax is to get a fair, is to end the current tax system that we have, which is a flat rate. Illinois is currently one of only 8 states in the nation that has a flat tax rate. And so if we were able to get a fair tax, which we're advocating for, it would mean that those who make more money will pay higher rates and that those who make less money will pay lower rates when we look at our taxes. In order to get a fair tax, we'll need to change the Illinois Constitution by passing a joint resolution for a constitutional amendment that will end the flat tax rate and call for a fair tax. If then we are able to do that, that joint resolution would have to pass in the General Assembly, and then voters will be able to decide on the November ballot if we want to have a fair tax for Illinois. Alongside that bill, we will have a separate bill that will actually have the details for creating a new tax rate, and we'll talk more about those details later in the proposal. So we have champions who are carrying the bills that we need to get a flat tax rate. So right now in the Senate, Don Harmon is the sponsor for the constitutional amendment. Representative Mitchell will also sponsor that amendment in the House. Senator Harmon has already introduced this resolution for the constitutional amendment. He's just in a process right now of changing some of the language to the bill, but the bill is already introduced. The bill that we have that will actually outline and create the new tax rate structure in the Senate will be carried by Senator Hutchinson and then Representative Lou Lang in the House. That bill would not be introduced until after the March primary. So the bill that will outline the actual tax rate will be, as I said before, introduced after the primary. It's going to raise $2 billion in new revenue, and it will be a tax cut for 90% of Illinois taxpayers. Anyone making less than $100,000 will get a tax cut, and then couples making $200,000 will also get a tax cut. So as we think about this campaign, there are two phases. So the first phase of the campaign is really focused on education. So what we will be doing in partnership with the Responsible Budget Coalition is going out to legislators, having some in-district meetings, and then also providing some education in the community, what will help us to raise the profile of the campaign. And then the second part of this campaign will be focused on more education to legislators and really hopefully having more pressure that we can put on our legislators to get them to vote in favor of the amendment. So when we think about just the in-district meetings with local elected officials, these are opportunities to, as you work with clients in the community, to also get them to come out, because it's best for elected officials to actually hear their stories of how they've been impacted by the programs in the community that have been cut. It's also good to just share what you've been seeing going on in your community and how your agency has been impacted. We have also worked with some groups who have decided that instead of just going alone to their going alone as an agency to their elected officials, they have been able to partner with other groups in the community to have meetings with their elected officials. So that person might be hearing from people representing different sectors like the social services, educators, and others. So this is a time where we'll want people to go in and just make a clear ask to the legislator of finding out, will they vote in support of placing a constitutional amendment for the fair tax on the ballot. And what it will also help to do as we're having these meetings is to take this information and report back to the Responsible Budget Coalition so that we can begin to get a sense of what legislators we think will actually vote in support of the amendment, so that we can kind of do our own internal roll call. And so there are some events that the Responsible Budget Coalition has been hosting throughout the state that we wanted to highlight. Now, we do know that some of these dates have passed, but we just want to make sure that you do at least see these contact individuals, because these were just kind of launching meetings for these local chapters. But if you contact the individuals here that are listed, or just contact Housing Action's office, we can still plug you into the people within your regions that are leading the charge for their community. So as we talk about phase one goals, we just wanted to give some examples of the work that advocates have been doing. So one great example recently is that we have had some organizations that have public actions, specifically around the Dr. King holiday. And so I know I attended one myself on the south side of Chicago at Trinity United Church of Christ, where there were community groups and faith-based groups coming out together, and also having legislators come out, and they directly asked them, will you support fair tax? And they also talked about other issues within their community. And I think what's really good about these public actions is it gives legislators an opportunity to see the support that we have in a community for the fair tax. Another big action that the Responsible Budget Coalition is launching is called the People's Budget. and this will be on February 14th, really in response to Governor Rauner's budget address. And so this is an opportunity really to share the vision that we have for Illinois to make sure that we have the revenue to really support the programs within our community. It's also an opportunity to show that there is a statewide presence and interest and support for the fair tax. And so right now, the Responsible Budget Coalition is reaching out to people and trying to get folks to commit to come down to Springfield. And again, if you are interested in doing that, you can contact us here at Housing Action. And the materials that we have provided for the PowerPoint today also have information about the People's Budget Address Rally. So phase 2 of the goal is, again, more high intensity. So at this point, we will have the legislation introduced that is that will create the new tax rate. So at that point, again, we will have, or the Responsible Budget Coalition will be hosting some different rallies to make sure that people know about it. The key rally we wanted to highlight will be on March 21st in Chicago, and that will be a rally for a fair tax. Again, it's an opportunity to get some press coverage and then show support that people have for the change in the tax system. And we will have there some bipartisan champions who also are pushing for the legislation. What we will also ask groups, and we will be doing in partnership with the Responsible Budget Coalition, is just continuing in different ways to build the support for the campaign. So that might look like attending town hall meetings and events of legislators and making sure that this discussion around the fair tax is a part of that agenda and that questions are asked. It might look like actually door knocking to see if you can get others in the community rallied in support for the fair tax. Public accountability session meetings are much like the examples that I gave you about the King Day events, where groups get legislators to come out and then they ask them to make a public commitment to support the fair tax. And then also what will be key to this time is that the General Assembly will be on recess from March 21st to April 8th. So that's a good opportunity to go back to a legislator and then have some of those in-district meetings where you can talk to them again about the campaign.
There was a question, Gianna, just to clarify what was happening on March 27th. I think that was a couple slides ago.
Yes, so on March 27th, there will be a rally for the fair tax here in Chicago. I'm not sure if they have the exact location yet, but we can get those details. And the goal is just to have a rally where we'll have a good number of people turn out, show their support for fair tax, get some press coverage, and then also there are some elected officials who will be out too, just to show that there's bipartisan support for the campaign.
Great, thank you. So is this the, this is where we are now?
Yes.
So that was, that question about March 27th was, someone did type that in, so thanks for having us clarify that. So if you do have other questions, either on your GoToWebinar control panel by using the question menu or the chat menu, you can let us know if you want us to clarify or come back to any points, or you have any questions or comments. So, and the next slide is just the contact if you want to bypass Housing Action Illinois, which we hope you don't, but if you want to, you can reach out directly to Alex Tyndall Weisendanger with the Responsible Budget Coalition, and there's his phone number and email. And he's really the main staff person making all this happen all around the state. So I think we are going to shift to the final part of the webinar right now, which is just giving a background on exactly why we need a fair tax for Illinois, and talk about some of the historical work on this issue. I think we'll reiterate some of the points that Gianna made earlier. And I'm going to be facilitating this part of the webinar. And again, I'm Bob Palmer. I'm the Policy Director for Housing Action Illinois. And looking down on the attendees on the phone, we have 35 or so people on the phone right now. I know several of you, as does Gianna. So again, thank you for participating. And we will be reaching out to all of you and others after the webinar to kind of get your thoughts and feedback, and talk to you about how you want to get involved in supporting the campaign in your local local community. So again, just to review who the Responsible Budget Coalition is, it is a coalition of over 300 organizations. It's cross-sector of human services, healthcare, higher education, faith communities, labor, and of course housing, and housing groups and groups that are working to end homelessness, very important, as well as centers for independent living. So, in Housing Action Illinois, we have been involved with the Responsible Budget Coalition for many years in the various campaigns. The RBC has been really key both times in recent years that we were able to advocate to increase the income tax in Illinois, which has been so helpful in making cuts or additional cuts beyond what's already happened to all the human service programs, including those that create affordable housing and end homelessness. And so that's why we've continued to participate for all these years, including this effort and previous efforts to pass a fair tax in Illinois. So the RBC's work is guided by three core principles: no more cuts to vital programs and services, adequate revenue to repair the damage done and make smart investments, and fairness in raising revenue. So just to talk about, if people can remember, before the budget impasse, that way back when, that Illinois has really always been sort of a medium or low tax state. Overall, we know that those interest groups that are really focused on cutting taxes in Illinois try and make the case that Illinois is a high tax state, and there are some taxes in Illinois that are higher than in other states, like property taxes, for example. But really, when you look at the data and look at the overall tax burden in the state, when you combine local and state taxes and the percentage of people's incomes that people pay on those taxes, we're really right about in the middle. And you can see in Illinois, we rank, or this is actually before the budget impasse, ranked 27th with a little more than 15% of total income going to local and state taxes. So in that, we compare favorably to nearby states like Indiana and Missouri, and only slightly lower than states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Iowa. So, but also before the budget impasse, and I think people on the webinar know this because there's so many social service providers and housing advocates and others, that we were underinvesting in our communities. We were 50th in the country in state support for public education, 50th in the country in full-time state workers per 1,000 residents, and 37th in total state expenditures per capita. Now, again, this is before the budget impasse. There have been some changes that have been made recently, and I think that people on the webinar know that Illinois just last year passed some legislation that's in the process of being implemented to increase state funding for public education, but that's only going to happen if the state actually has the revenue in order to do that. There's nothing in the legislation itself that provides the resources. It just plays with the funding formula and with the goal of making it more fair and equitable and to increase investment, but we still need the money. So where does the money go? So as someone who's gone down to work at the state capitol for many years, I know this, but it's also, if you just pay attention to the political debate in the newspapers, there is often a belief that that's misapplied, that Chicago and the Chicago metropolitan area are getting all the state resources. But if you look at this chart right here, map of the state, I won't go over it in detail. It's basically showing who's paying tax money around the state and where the money is going. And basically, this shows in the green and blue areas that those areas are, compared to what they're getting back, are paying relatively less in taxes, which in and of itself isn't the worst thing, and we're not here on this webinar to debate this, but I think it's important to remember, particularly looking at the most southernmost counties in Illinois, that they have extremely high poverty, and as a result, there are a lot of state-funded services that go to serve people in those counties. And so in a way, this map makes sense. But again, we're not going to go super detailed into right now, but if you're talking to people in other parts of the state or your own part of the state, I think this is an important information to have at your fingertips. So again, going back before the budget impasse, Governor Rauner and the General Assembly decided to allow the income tax to fall. So, and again, the Responsible Budget Coalition, I think if I remember correctly, going back to like 2011, when Governor Quinn was still in office, we were very active with the coalition in their efforts to increase the income tax, because the state was really suffering from the after effects of the Great Recession. And we actually, we being the Responsible Budget Coalition, advocated that that income tax increase be permanent. But the General Assembly and the governor, in our opinion, kind of took the easy way out, and they made the tax increase temporary. And then when it came to the point in 2014 to decide what to do, and we were advocating that, again, it be made permanent or extended, the General Assembly and the governor's office did not come through, and the tax increase went down, which made the state's longstanding fiscal problems even worse, and led directly to the 2-year state budget impasse between Governor Rauner and the General Assembly that caused so many problems for social service providers around the state, including forcing some agencies to close or lay off staff, reduce services, and we still see the implications of that decision today. But basically, in 2014, the personal income tax rate went back down from 5% to 3.75%, and the corporate income tax rate went from 7 to 5.25%. And this created a $5 billion budget deficit. So the last tax cut, again, this is the tax cut that happened after the decision was made not to extend or make permanent the temporary tax increase before the budget impasse started. That primarily benefited the wealthy. There's a whole lot of information on this chart, and I'm not going to go over it, but let's look at the won't go over everything in detail, but let's look at the far most right column where it shows percentage of tax filers. And it shows that people earning less, or households earning less than $25,000 a year make up, more than half of tax filers, and then people earning between $25,000 and $35,000 make up about 9%. So that's in total the bottom 60% of tax filers. So the average cut they received, again, we'll just say for the lowest income group, was a little more than $100, $106.89. So compare that to the top 11% of tax filers. Again, this is on the right-hand column. Those people earning $100,000 or more, the top 11% of tax filers. Their average cut, and we'll skip to, let's say, people earning over $1 million or more, the average tax cut they got because of that decision back in 2014 was over $36,000, $36,797. And I'll just say, to me personally, that seems really unfair and misguided in terms of public policy, especially considering, that Illinois is not a high tax state, considering the state's huge budget problems and how those, cutbacks on state services really disproportionately affect people with the lowest incomes. It just seems unfair and unjust. And I'm assuming that most of the people on this webinar, everyone on this webinar also agrees with that. So that's why it's so important that we all get involved over the next few months in the Fair Tax campaign. So the budget impasse. And again, this isn't news to, I think, most of the people on the webinar, but basically we went with 2 years without a budget, and the backlog of unpaid bills reached more than $16 billion. Just as an example, road construction projects stopped. That's something that impacted kind of everyone around the state. The state was downgraded to near junk status, the lowest state rating in U.S. history, and people are denied essential services while providers go over a year without receiving payments. So, and again, and just to go back to some of the things that Gianna was talking about earlier, we know, like, for example, in the supportive housing line item that pays for services with a people of history of homelessness or severe mental illness who live in permanent supportive housing around the state during this period, particularly during the 2016 fiscal year, providers were not getting any money. So there were some small number of providers that did close entirely, but many more providers just stopped providing the services. And the data we have from the Department of Human Services for that year shows that several thousand fewer people reserved that are got those services that are so critical to helping them maintain their housing. Again, homeless prevention funds, basically, there were almost no homeless prevention dollars available during that year from the state. So that program assists, I think, about 4,000 households annually with small homelessness prevention grants. So those families couldn't get the grants. We don't know what happened to all those families, but based on past experience, I think it's safe to say that a lot of them wound up being evicted or otherwise losing their housing and having to, go into a homeless shelter or double up with, someone else, maybe pull their kids out of school, which obviously has huge implications for those families directed, but also, long-term has big social costs to the state. So finally, and again, many of you on the phone worked with us in the Responsible Budget Coalition. In July of 2017, we had a big victory and the budget impasse ended. And this happened when the General Assembly overrode Governor Rauner's veto of the income tax increase and the budget that the General Assembly passed. And there was bipartisan support for that with Democrats and some Republicans voting for that as well. Restoring the individual income tax rate from 3.75% to 4.95%, restoring the corporate income tax rate from 5.25% to 7%. There were some progressive elements, and again, this is a fundamental belief of the Responsible Budget Coalition that when we raise revenue, it has to be done fairly, which basically means in a progressive manner, that it prohibits a taxpayer with an adjusted gross income of more than $250,000 or $500,000 for spouses filing a joint federal return from claiming a standard exemption, the property tax credit, education expense credit. There was also an expansion of the earned income tax credit. There was an increase in the maximum education expense credit, and I created a new tax credit for teachers using their personal income for instructional materials, and 3 corporate tax loopholes were closed. So that was a really great victory, but unfortunately, Illinois is still drowning in red ink, and there were over $3 billion in cuts, including through creating a Tier 2 pension system, cuts to higher education, cuts to transfers to local government, and additional human service line items zeroed out. It did authorize $6 billion in bonding. Again, that's debt that the state does need to repay at some point, and authorized $1.5 billion in special fund transfers, which has to be paid back in 24 months. So I'm just going to pause here, and I'm going to check the questions. I don't see any new questions or chats, so we'll feel free to enter those, and we'll get back to those in a little bit if there are any. But I also want to pause here again just to talk about some of the specific housing and homeless line items have been impacted by this whole longstanding fiscal problems of the state. So, for example, in the state budget, there's this, and this is not a slide in your in the webinar, but it is available, and maybe after the webinar, I'll send out a link to where you can get it. But the state has a line item called Emergency and Transitional Housing that funds about 100 different agencies around the state that operate homeless shelters and transitional housing programs. Now, when I started back at Housing Action Illinois like 15 years ago, the line item for that program was funded at $9.3 million. And today, on February 1st, 2017, the funding for that line item is still $9.3 million. So, but yet, over all those years, you know, the expenses of running homeless shelters and transitional housing programs have been going up, and there hasn't even been, you know, one significant increase for that program. So, you know, essentially that is a budget cut that we've had for those programs over the years. Back way before the budget impasse started, the homeless prevention program used to be funded at $11 million. At one point, it went down, I think, to like $1.5 million, and now we're still only at $4 million. So again, other big significant cut because of the state's long-standing budget problems. And then again, with supportive housing, particularly for the line item that funds supportive housing for people with a history of homelessness, it's been a huge effort over the last couple of years to maintain that funding with the work of the Supportive Housing Providers Association and others. And Governor Rauner has been proposing to zero that line item out, or at least that's what he initially did, or if not zeroed out, make really significant cuts. And again, that funding is really crucial to helping people maintain their housing. And if we're really significant about, you know, ending homelessness, we should be increasing the number of supportive housing units available and increasing funding for supportive housing services. And then also just one more thing, the Illinois Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is the state's main dedicated revenue source to build and preserve affordable housing, as part of this deal to end the budget impasse, as has happened in the past. There was money diverted from that fund, and back in July, there was $5 million diverted from that fund. So that's $5 million that didn't go to creating or preserving new affordable housing units. So again, this is just a graph on sort of more cuts outside the direct homeless and housing line items. But I know, and I know from looking at who's on the webinar, we do have some people from the Centers for Independent Living and Standards Independent Living Centers, but again, 12% cut, which makes it extremely difficult for them to provide services to people with disabilities who need housing or other types of social service supports. I know from talking, and Gianna did as well, to Centers for Independent Living throughout the budget impasse, I know they were really struggling. Many of them laid off staff, went on reduced hours, so maybe they were only open, 3 or 4 days a week, and again, they're still trying to recover from that, because when the budget impasse got solved, it didn't mean that everything went back to normal with the agencies around the state. So again, it's even worse than it seems. So basically, and again, I'm not going to go over in this detail, but for different categories in the state budget, it compares funding in way back when in 2000 to the FY18, which is currently the fiscal year and right now, appropriated expenditures, and then adjusting those 2000 expenditures for inflation and population, and looking at the difference. And you can see, again, higher education, 51% effective cut, human services, 27.2 effective cut, public safety, 17% effective cut, and healthcare, 14% effective cut. So where do we go from here? A fair tax for Illinois. That's why we're all on the webinar today, because we all want to work for that, where people with higher incomes pay higher rates and people with lower incomes pay lower rates. So again, this is going to be reiterating some of the information that Gianna went over before. Illinois is one of only 4 states that mandates a flat tax in our Constitution, and 33 states, Washington, D.C. and the federal government use a fair tax structure. And again, nearly all the income growth over the past decade has been among the top % of earners. So if we want a tax system that's responsive to that, we really need to have a fair tax, and a flat tax really kind of fares miserably on that. And again, states with a fair tax on average grow their economies as fast or faster as states that do not. I think there's a slide that'll be coming back soon to talk more about that. And again, a flat tax is unfair. This chart shows among the different income brackets, who pays what percentage of their total family income they pay in taxes, and people with the lowest percent pay the highest share of their income, and the people with the biggest incomes pay the lowest share of their income in taxes. So it just makes sense. Couldn't agree more. Amending the Illinois Constitution to allow a fair tax would result in a tax cut for 80 to 90% of people in Illinois, and raise an additional $1.3 billion to repair the damage done by the budget impasse and make smart investments in building thriving communities across our state. So again, this is information Gianna went over before. We need to pass a joint resolution for a constitutional amendment through the House and Senate by May 10th. The resolution requires a 3/5 vote. And step 2, then the question would be on the ballot in the November general election. And then if we vote in favor, the Constitution is amended. That automatically doesn't create a fair tax or progressive income tax all by itself. At that point, we'd have to go back to the General Assembly and the governor and appeal to them and lobby and advocate that they actually pass legislation creating the fair tax. But we can't do any of that unless we amend the Constitution. And again, just one more point, separate legislation, and Gianna pointed out that's going to be introduced, at least a proposal for that, so we kind of know what people are thinking. I don't think it won't be passed this year, would set the specific rate structure. So again, going back to the kind of two approaches to tax policy and looking at examples and experiences of other states in recent history, Kansas and Minnesota. So Kansas cut its top personal income tax rate from 6% to 4.5% in 2012. And you can see in the subsequent bullet points all the bad ways this impacted Kansas. Their bond rating fell, projected to lose huge amounts of revenue, $9.20 million in FY17. They had to cut education and infrastructure, and this year is actually the Republican legislature in Kansas that overrode the governor to restore taxes because there was just bipartisan belief like, hey, you know, we tried this, didn't work. Now compare that to Minnesota, where they raised income taxes in 2013. They created the third highest top marginal personal income tax rate in the country, 9.85%. Again, that's just for the highest income earners. And the situation they're in now is that they've got a $1.4 billion budget surplus. They've got the fastest growing economy in the Midwest, and unemployment is continuing to fall while at the same time median household income is increasing. And if you don't believe us, down at the bottom there, you can see the sources for that. So check it out yourself. So again, I think the subsequent slides sort of get back into the next steps. And we're going to be reaching out to all of you about this to talk about what you're in a position and what you have a desire or willingness to do. We really need people to contact their state senator and state representative to express your support for a fair tax. So it's great if you do that on your own, but actually if you get involved in things that are going on in your local community that the Responsible Budget Coalition or others are organizing, the impact of your work is really going to be leveraged. I know in the earlier slides, Gianna talked about some of the areas of the state where there's actually the Responsible Budget Coalition is organized local chapters. If you're not in one of those parts of the state, we still really need you to be involved, reaching out to your legislators, and we can, our legislators, and we can plug you in to connect with other people in your community who are working on this, and there may be additional local meetings and clusters going on as we get closer to the vote. And again, I would also just add, adding on to what Gianna said, that I think historically, when we've worked on this in the past, there has been the feeling that the Senate, we're more secure about actually having the votes in the Senate to get this passed. And there's been more of a question about, do we have the votes in the House to get this passed, which is why I think in a lot of the communications you'll see from the RBC and us and others about this, the focus is on talking to your state representative. We need you to talk to your state senator too, but again, the focus is more on the representatives. And it's you know, really important to be in the know, and that's why, again, why it's important to be in touch with the RBC or Housing Action Illinois or these local clusters, because particularly the RBC has already been talking to specific legislators and has a sense both in the Senate and the House about who's already on board and who is really kind of on the fence. And I think we're going to be really focusing on those legislators that are currently on the fence and perhaps undecided and expressing some openness to voting for the fair tax. And wow, that is the last slide. And again, popping up here, again, is Alex's contact information. He is the field director and policy specialist with the Responsible Budget Coalition, and there's his phone number right there. But I'm going to go back super fast in the slides to the point where Oh, there we are. And you even have photos of myself and Gianna and Willie. So we'd love to talk to you all about uh, your interest and thoughts on the Fair Tax campaign. So please reach out to us, and just to sneak preview, if we don't hear from you, it's in all likelihood you might be hearing from us in the coming days with more information and to get your questions and comments and feedback. So I am going to check in again when I do see. Oh, the question is, can you please show the previous slide again? Thanks. Unfortunately, I didn't see when you typed that in, so I don't know what slide you're referring to. So it'll be a couple minutes before we're getting off if you want to provide some more detail, or otherwise, and I want to make this clear, in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar control panel on your computer or the on your phone even, I believe, that there are 3 handouts. One is a PDF file of the slides from today. One is a PDF that is a flyer for the People's Budget Address that's happening in Springfield in 2014. And then there's also a sign-up sheet that obviously, if you fill that out, you need to return it to us here at Housing Action or Alex directly if you're working with the group to cement your own interests or other people's interests for being involved in the People's Budget Address on February 14th. So, and I think we'll also be emailing out we also will be emailing out the slides afterwards. So if you did have any questions about the slides that you weren't able to ask today or upon further reflection, please be in contact with us. So again, just put one more call out for any comments or questions. I see there's one person on the call who has their hand up. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. I'm going to try, this is sort of an experiment, try unmuting your line and see if there's a couple people with their hands up. So I'm going to try unmuting your guys' lines and see if that actually works to let you ask a question to the group. So those 2 people are unmuted if you want to say anything. Okay, well, I guess they don't have anything to say. So again, there not being any questions, I'm seeing, oh, actually, there are actually, one person wrote good presentation, and then another question that came in. On the slide, it's even worse than it seems. Why isn't housing listed? It seems like we're always clumped under human services. Is there any way we can get our own line item? So the webinar slides were created by the Responsible Budget Coalition for a wide audience, and they were generous enough to let us and other groups use their slides. So I think that's why for this Housing Action Illinois webinar, everything is kind of lumped under human services. So, but definitely, I think the invitation to use those RBC slides is open to other groups, and I think as we did today, other groups can feel free to provide some more details about, the line items or parts of the budget that you care about. I should also say that one thing, and I'll just come back to this, and maybe that will close, is one important thing that's been, I think, crucial to the Responsible Budget Coalition's success is that the Budget Coalition has been focused on increasing revenue and hasn't gotten into debates about where the money should be spent on education or different parts of the, human service sector, including childcare or, housing or homelessness or, after-school programs or early childhood education, any of that. Because, and I think this is something that the leadership with the Responsible Budget Coalition Office often says is, the catchphrase is, we all do better when we all do better. So if we have the revenue available, then obviously we'll all continue to advocate for our specific line items and we care about. But we're the strongest force if we're all kind of making the case for revenue and talking most broadly as possible. Again, obviously, we all have the line items we care about. We'll all talk about, specific needs, but I think that's also part of why the reason the RBC materials don't talk so much about the really kind of specific needs getting down into individual line items or issues. So, but again, I think after the webinar, we will, in addition to the handouts, we'll add another link to a fact sheet that shows some specific impacts on the housing and homeless line items because of the budget impasse. So I see it's just about 11:57, just about noon. So take one more look at the chat window, and I don't see anything new. So we're going to sign off now. So again, be in contact with us, and if we don't hear from you, you'll be hearing from us. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a good day.